This is the story of a man, Lucius Aemilius Paullus. But not only. This is the story of the end of an era, the end of the legend of the invincible Macedonic phalanx. But not only. This is the story of the end of Macedon. A little kingdom, a speck on the map almost, north of Greece. A little kingdom that changed the world completely by collapsing the Persian Empire, by creating some of the dynasties that dominated both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, while Rome was making its first steps onto power. And while the clash is interesting, the battle has been discussed to death around the online space, everything that's around it is just as important. So let us begin. Lucius Aemilius Paullus was the man who ended Macedon. He did it in 168 BC on the battlefield of Pydna. He crushed the most powerful Hellenistic kingdom left in the Eastern Mediterranean, brought its king to his knees and delivered a victory so total that the monarchy ceased to exist. For a few brief weeks, he was the most powerful man in Rome. His army had stood unbroken, his discipline had held, and his strategy had exposed the weakness of a formation that had once ruled the world. And yet today, his name is barely known, overshadowed by Scipio Africanus, forgotten in the shadow of Caesar. Lucius Aemilius Paullus is one of the most successful generals in Roman history, remembered by the few who study him not for his glory, but for his restraint. He was not loved, he was not feared, but he was respected. And when Rome called, needing someone to finish the war against Macedon, they called upon a man who had already lived a lifetime of silence and duty. His story begins with shame. The name Paullus was once cursed. In 216 BC, during the Second Punic War, another Lucius Aemilius Paullus, his father, served as consul at the Battle of Cannae. There, the Roman Republic suffered its gravest military disaster, an annihilation so complete that almost 50,000 Roman soldiers were left dead on the field. Paullus the Elder died fighting alongside them, his name engraved into Roman memory not as a hero but as one of the architects of disaster. For his son, that meant a life lived beneath a shadow. He was born into a patrician line, one of Rome's oldest, proudest families, but noble blood was not enough to erase failure. Roman aristocracy demanded more than lineage, it demanded success, and lack of success was a curse. Lucius began his career the traditional way, moving through Rome's cursus honorum with quiet efficiency. He held office, performed his duties, and made no waves. He was not a populist, he did not give stirring speeches. There is no record of him raising mobs or charming crowds. Even his political allies were few. But those who watched him saw something else: discipline, patrician dignity. The kind of man who obeyed orders and expected others to do the same. In a Senate increasingly filled with ambition and spectacle, Paullus was a throwback, more feared in silence than most men were in words. He first commanded in the north, in the mountains of Liguria. There, against rugged tribes who used ambushes and terrain as weapons, Paullus led a short but effective campaign. There was no triumph, no grand prize, but the work was done cleanly against the Gallic tribes of the area. He disappeared from the record for years afterward. Rome was between great wars, and Paullus was not the kind of man who forced himself into the spotlight. He served quietly, but in the east, tensions were rising. Macedon had once been the master of Greece. Under Philip II and Alexander the Great, it had conquered the known world. But by the 2nd century BC, it was a shadow of that empire. Still, it remained rich, organized, and dangerous. The Macedonian phalanx was the standard meta-military formation at the time. It was a weapon forged by Philip II and perfected under Alexander in its tactical use. It was a simple concept in theory, but hard to put on the battlefield with people who truly feared death. Long pikes, named sarissas, were used conjointly by the formation in order to create a porcupine in front of it, something no one would want to charge into, and that was perfect to push enemy formations. While of course deadly, its strength was in its tactical utilization, since it was capable of holding a line beautifully. The ability to push enemies where you wanted it made it the perfect anvil for a hammer, and Macedon had that hammer in a strong cavalry. In 179 BC, the throne had passed to a new king, Perseus, the latest expression of the Antigonid dynasty that had ruled since Alexander the Great, started by one of his diadochi, one of his generals. Perseus was educated, cautious and politically shrewd. He did not seek immediate war with Rome, but he began to maneuver, since Rome was getting closer and closer, operating in what he perceives as his sphere of influence. Now, Philip V, Perseus' father, had fought 2 wars against Rome. The first ended in a draw. The second ended in his humiliating defeat at the hands of Rome. Philip was forced to disband much of his army, pay indemnities, and abandon all influence over Greece. He became in practice a client king, independent in name but constantly watched by Roman envoys, and punished whatever he stepped out of line. Yet, in his final years, Philip tried to rebuild. He expanded into Thrace, reformed his finances, and prepared the ground for his son. So why do we look at the war we're about to talk about instead of this previous one as the final showdown between Romans and Macedonian, other than chronology, of course? What I mean is the final showdown between the Macedonian phalanx and the Roman maniple. The Second Macedonian War was a complicated one. Philip found himself embroiled in various situations with Pergamum, Rhodes, the Ptolemaic Egypt, and so when Rome intervened, it didn't really fight the best Macedon had to offer. It entered a war that was complex and didn't favor the Macedonians at all. And so Perseus continued his father's legacy by preparing for war against Rome again, to regain his position of power in the Greek galaxy. All of this maneuvering, marrying strategically, gathering allies, rebuilding his military strength, didn't go unnoticed. Rome was watching. It was familiar. They knew Macedon could be dangerous, at least for their dominion in the east region around Greece, and they were ready to intervene. In 171 BC, Rome declared war. For 3 years, the conflict stagnated. The Senate sent men of little talent, distracted by politics or incompetent in the field. The Roman army was large and well equipped, but it could not break Perseus. He held the mountain passes, chose favorable ground, and avoided open battle. And for a time, it worked. Perseus even scored a limited victory at Callincus, where Roman forces had to retreat in disarray. But rather than press the advantage, the Macedonian king hesitated. Whether out of fear, over caution, or political pressure at home, he allowed the war to drag on. Of course, that is only true if our hypothesis is that if he pushed, he would have won the war, but this is a common interpretation. By 168 BC, the Senate had lost its patience. Rome needed a commander who would not fail, who would not indulge luxury, who would not disgrace the Republic. So they turned to a man who had waited in silence for 20 years for his turn. Lucius Aemilius Paullus was elected consul for the second time. He was 60 years old now, with his life mostly behind him. He had no political base, no promises to make. He simply prepared to go to war. And in a system like the Republic of Rome, constantly fighting itself for supremacy, with people trying to create a political base for everything, all the time, an old guy with military experience and no real future is the most dangerous person of all for external enemies, because there's no corrupting him, there is no stopping him, there is nothing other than the battlefield. When he arrived in Greece, Lucius found chaos. The Roman army was bloated, disorganized and lazy. Officers traveled with luxury baggage, entourages, and even entertainers. Soldiers had grown soft, morale was low, discipline a memory. Paullus acted immediately. He reviewed the ranks, dismissed 2,000 men on the spot, and personally inspected every unit on the field. He imposed order. He reduced baggage limits. He restored the nightly watch. He ordered daily drills, spoke little, and punished quickly. To many of the men, it must have felt like a return to the past. To Paullus, it was simply how things were done. But Paullus didn't have just tradition and strictness on his side. He had a superpower, at least for a Roman. He had patience. While Perseus remained entrenched in favorable positions, Paullus refused to take the bait. He studied the terrain slowly, sent scouts, and moved small units at night, testing the enemy lines. And when the moment came, he struck not directly but indirectly, outflanking Perseus' position at Tempe and forcing him to fall back. Finally, Perseus offered battle, but only after a sign from the heavens. The night before the Battle of Pydna, a lunar eclipse turned the moon blood red. The Macedonian army was terrified. To them, it was a dark omen. In contrast, Paullus gathered his men and performed a public sacrifice, calmly explaining the astronomical cause. He was handling his troops just as much as he was handling the battlefield. The day after, the lines were drawn for the Battle of Pydna. The Macedonian phalanx advanced in perfect formation. The sarissas must have looked like a wall of iron. At first, the Romans gave ground. The sheer mass of the phalanx was impossible to break head-on, but the terrain began to shift. The flat ground gave way to broken hills, uneven patches, and streams. The phalanx, which depended entirely on cohesion, began to buckle. As gaps opened between units, the Roman maniples surged. Now, what made the maniples so good against the phalanx was adaptability. The officers on the ground had a level of discretionality to what they were doing. They could decide how to act, and in that way, be able to find the gaps between the lines of the enemy and use them without the orders of their superior officers. Once the gap was closed and the sarissa became useless, the gladius became king. Now, let's stop for a second and talk about sources. We get a lot of this story from Livy, but Livy was working directly from a primary source, Polybius, an Achaean general and politician that was accompanying the Roman army as a prisoner. Now, while we do still have the writings of Polybius, we do not have the part about the battle. And so we're forced to use Livy, or Titus Livius in Latin, as our secondary source for the primary source of Polybius. Of course, our old friend Plutarch could not resist talking about Pydna, but his description is smaller, more concise than the one we get from Livy. Now, we have given a quick description of generally how the battle went, the rough terrain, the gladius defeating the sarissa in close quarters, but that, what I've given to you, is the traditional narrative of this battle, what you can find in a lot of shorts, in a lot of YouTube videos, in a lot of documentaries. In reality, the battle is far more complex and a little more fun. While it is true that there was a retreat that brought the enemy on uneven ground, that was only at the beginning of the battle, and it wasn't the decisive factor of it. So let's see how the Romans actually defeated the phalanx. First of all, the battle was fought on a line of around 3 kilometers, a very long battle, and began with an encounter that was completely random. both forces were sending troops forward while they were trying to deploy, trying to understand the enemy. They were scouting each other deploying, and so the troops moving would encounter each other. The first contact was between Thracian scouts and Ligurian scouts, so not even Macedonians and Romans. Then it became a real fight where the Agema, light infantry from the Macedonian side, elite light infantry, encountered two Italian cohorts. Now, the Agema really won this confrontation, but the Italians were able to resist breaking. And so they started retreating and retreating and retreating, putting the enemy on the flank of the First Legion of Aemilius Paullus. This is one of those moments where Aemilius Paullus really shines with his calm demeanor. He was able to assess the situation, to look at the Italian allies and see that while they weren't able to overcome the Agema, they were able to hold them off. So he didn't turn the legion and he just advanced, leaving an enemy literally on his side, even behind him. It was a tactical mistake by the book, but in reality it worked. Now, just to keep breaking the immersion, the right wing of the Romans had elephants. Now, you don't imagine elephants in a Roman army usually, but they did, and their use broke the Macedonians on that flank. After all, the elephants are made to break formations in war, of course, and the phalanx, when it breaks, it's very vulnerable. Now, it has to be said that the left flank of the Macedonians, fighting the right flank of the Romans, was composed mainly of mercenary troops and auxiliaries, collapsing against such a pressure. Now, at the center, the real battle was about to begin. The First Legion, with Aemilius Paullus at the head, was about to fight against the bulk of the Macedonic phalanx. The phalanx passed over a stream, losing a little bit of its cohesion, but testimony says that Aemilius Paullus was afraid while looking at them. Then a weak point was noticed. Remember the Agema advancing now behind the First Legion? The fact that they were behind meant that there was a hole in the Macedonian formation. That meant that there was a way to go around the phalanx. Immediately on the left flank of the phalanx, the Romans began to harass, turning what should have been a disadvantage into a key advantage. The Macedonians tried to react, sending men to fight the Romans, but with all of these duels going around and people trying to help, the Macedonian formation was breaking. After all, there was no way to coherently send men to help. It was about soldiers' bravery. They were taking decisions, taking initiative, and not necessarily doing the best to hold the formation itself. On the Macedonian right flank, the situation was even worse. The Romans arrived so quickly and moved so fast that they attacked the Macedonians before they could complete their line. And with their deployment incomplete, the Second Legion could infiltrate and overwhelm them completely. If we go by the word of Plutarch, the battle lasted less than an hour. And that is considering the travel time for the armies to deploy. It was so quick that Perseus and his cavalry weren't even on the battlefield yet when their army collapsed. He left the field with 500 men, abandoning the over 20,000 Macedonian soldiers who were killed. 11,000 were captured. The Roman losses were minimal. In a single day, the kingdom of Macedon ceased to exist. The Antigonid dynasty, which had ruled it for generations, was no more. Paullus, the sources say, did not celebrate immediately. He walked the battlefield in silence. According to Plutarch, he stared at the corpses in horror and whispered that such fortune was not lasting. And he was right. In the days that followed this triumph, both of his surviving sons died suddenly. They weren't touched by enemies. They fell ill and perished. Rome, always alert to divine irony, saw it as a cosmic trade, a kingdom for children. Paul, ever Roman, made no public complaint. He returned to Rome to receive his triumph. Behind him marched the prisoners, including Perseus, now a defeated king in chains. The spoils of Macedon followed. Gold, weapons, statues, paintings, Greek art flooded into Rome. The elite began to decorate their home with foreign works. Roman culture, once austere and brutal, began to soften under Hellenic influence. And at the heart of it stood Paullus, the man who had delivered it and who seemed untouched by it. He gave no grand speeches, he built no monuments to himself. He dictated his share of the spoils be given and used for public works, and then he stepped back into silence. He lived a few more years, long enough to serve as censor and impose financial discipline on the state, and then he died, as he lived, respected, mourned, and already half forgotten. But his legacy did not die. His adopted son, Scipio Aemilianus, would go on to destroy Carthage, sack Numantia, and become the most powerful man of his generation. He had been raised in Paullus' house, taught by Greek tutors, and shaped by a man who embodied the final breath of the old republic. But now that we have finished the story of Paullus, let's follow the story of Macedon for a while. Perseus' end wasn't flashy, there was no execution, no dramatic suicide, no blaze of final glory. He simply vanished into the shadow of the Republic. He was kept alive for a time, paraded later in Paullus' triumph, then quietly imprisoned in Alba Fucens, a mountain town where he died a few years later. Macedon did not resist the Roman occupation. There were no loyalist rebellions, no hidden armies, no surviving heirs with the charisma to rally a defense. The monarchy had concentrated all power into itself, and when the king fell, so did the state. Paullus understood the opportunity at the time, but he did not immediately annex Macedon. That was not Rome's way. Rome had conquered Italy by creating allies, forced allies, but allies nonetheless. And so, he disassembled the kingdom. Macedon was divided into 4 separate republics, each forbidden from contacting the others. Intermarriage was banned. Trade between regions was limited. The Macedonian currency was reformed, no more royal insignia to be seen on it. The local elites who had once served the king were quietly replaced or neutered. Anything that made Macedon Macedon was dismantled. There was nothing to rally around, no bureaucracy to resist from within, no army to regroup. What the Romans performed, maybe because Macedon was so threatening, so powerful, at least in its history, well, it was a complete political lobotomy. The machinery of statehood was dismantled, leaving behind local autonomies without cohesion. The result was desolation. Not yet a province, but no longer a kingdom. It would remain that way until 146 BC, when Rome finally annexed it as a full province. Now, this devastating result wasn't standard, it wasn't what the Romans did every time. It was the result of Paullus spending months in Greece and Macedon. He spent time inspecting cities, overseeing settlements, enforcing Senate decrees. In Epirus, accused of having secretly supported Perseus, he carried out one of the most brutal punitive actions in Roman history. 70 cities were looted in a single coordinated operation. 150,000 people were enslaved and sold on the market in one day. The wealth of Epirus was stripped bare and distributed to Paullus' men, as promised. Now this was brutal, but it didn't really create a negative connotation to Paullus' figure. This was kinda standard, Paullus just did it better than anyone else. In Macedonia and southern Greece, Paullus was more restrained. He paid careful attention to the traditions of the local people. He visited temples, he issued proclamations in Greek, he allowed cities that had remained neutral to keep their privileges. Paullus did not wage war against all Greeks, only against those who had dared resist Rome. This mixture of mercy and ruthlessness was not arbitrary, it was Roman. And it reveals something critical about how Rome operated at this stage of its expansion. Unlike the monarchies of the Hellenistic world, Rome did not conquer to expand borders, it conquered to destroy rivals primarily. It did not always build in the wake of conquest, because it didn't necessarily consider the territory to be theirs. Often, it simply removed threats and left behind managed disorder. And when it did build, it built for function, not necessarily glory. It was only in later stages of Roman expansion that the idea of building while you conquer started to really take hold. So, in the end, while being forgotten by popular culture, Aemilius Paullus is significant. He is the pivot point, the man who mastered a system just as it began to fray. His victory at Pydna was a triumph not only over Macedon, but of the republican method itself, a decentralized, institutionalized method of government, based heavily on the personal virtues of the people controlling it. That system worked for a while, and then it didn't. Rome's later crisis, economic collapse, civil war, autocracy, didn't happen despite men like Paullus. They happened in part because of what men like Paullus enabled: empire. Every victory, every province added after Pydna brought wealth, instability, and temptation. Every campaign that filled the treasury also emptied the moral balance, we could say, of Rome. But if we don't want to sail the ship of morality, we can just say that more money created more corruption, created more problems, created more slaves, gathering a huge population of workers that were taking the place of the Roman farmer. Now, of course, some of you are gonna see a parallel with political situations of today, but at the time, this was a very serious and direct problem. Roman legionaries were farmer soldiers. If you don't have farmers with political rights, meaning the Roman farmers, you don't have soldiers. This is the reason why Marius rose to power. This is the reason why legions became directly connected to their generals. This is the reason why civil wars became possible. And in saying this, I'm not taking a moral stance against anything. I am just explaining that the consequences of the action of great men like Paullus created the corruption they were themselves trying to fight against. Thank you for listening until the end, and please leave a like if you enjoyed, comment, that helps with the algorithm, and I'll see you soon for Augustus Part 2, Civil War.